Hey folks, welcome to Snowpal Podcast. Our guest today is Joshua Altman. Joshua is the managing director at Beltway Media. Beltway Media provides fractional chief communications officers. Joshua, thanks for taking the time to chat.
Thank you for having me.
My pleasure. I asked you for a few topics and you mentioned a few things, and all of them are of equal interest to me. Before we get into the topic, can you just give a brief introduction about yourself and your company to our audience, and then we can jump into the topic?
I'm the managing director at Beltway Media. What we do is we provide fractional chief communications officers for startups, small and medium businesses, and professional services firms. My background, I started as a journalist. I left journalism to work in the corporate world and do consulting, and that eventually turned into what we do now as fractional chief communications officers.
Well, thank you very much for that introduction, Joshua. So there's a few different things we want to talk about, but let's start with one of the very basics. There are many things I don't know, and when I have these conversations with distinguished guests such as yourselves, so I start with just me educating myself about the area of expertise of the guest. So with that said, what does a chief communications officer do, and who do they work with? I mean, we are a startup, right? We are a product company. We have a few different products. So is it for startups? Is it for large companies, mid-sized companies? What is that role, and who does it generally apply to?
It applies to businesses of all sizes. You're seeing this role become more common with Fortune 500s, with large sports teams, and other big organizations. You're also seeing it at smaller companies and at startups, because the role of a chief communications officer is to shape perception and to build and maintain trust. Where people are more familiar with a chief marketing officer or a chief brand officer, those are roles that are similar but not exactly the same. We're focused on how we take an integrated, big picture view of how your messaging impacts reputation, growth, and stakeholder confidence. And that's your messaging internally, externally, investor relations, anything where you're telling your story, where you are communicating. That is where the chief communications officer comes in.
Wow. Okay. And then you said it works. It is applicable to companies of all sizes. But a lot of my questions here are going to be from the perspective of a startup, simply because I run one of them. I've worked for large companies over the years, but most of my career worked with small companies, and I've been running my company for a while. So my questions will be very specific. Perhaps the answers might be generic to larger companies, but just giving you a little bit of context to where I'm going to be thinking from here. Okay. So let's say I'm going to take us as an example, Joshua, just so I understand and our audience understands our offerings to some extent as well. So we are a product company. Let's say we have B2B products and B2C products. There are some things that come naturally to us. At least we want to believe that as engineers, where we write software, make sure it's reliable, it's scalable, and all of those nice things. Before I started the company, I thought those were the only important things, or those were the most difficult things, just because I had only done them all my life. But immediately after we launched, it didn't even take too long. I recognized, even after the first version, right? We are like 200 plus versions in now. But even after the very first version, I recognized that there was a lot more to running a company. And there was many, many, many things that I had absolutely no idea about, right? Like even the unknown unknowns, if you will, right? And I started appreciating all of the other roles a whole lot more than engineering in itself, because what comes a little bit naturally to you tend to not respect it as much because you can do it. But what does not come naturally to you, or what you don't know, becomes all the more important because it's difficult and complex to understand. So sales and marketing has been a very challenging learning curve. We are nowhere near the top of the learning curve, but it's an ongoing organic process. Now, as I get closer to understanding some of that, you've come in and said something entirely new, a chief, communications officer. And I know you called out for the separation, but if you don't mind one more time, for a lot of us laymen who don't understand the nuances of the differences, like what is sales and marketing as opposed to communication, right? I mean, I understand the word. I maybe know a little bit about, I'm just going to go by context, but I think it'd be best if you explained it to us nicely with an example.
So at the most basic level, corporate communications, it's how companies communicate with external and internal audiences to achieve their goals and manage reputation. Your goal is sales. Part of sales is going to be communications. So communications is much more foundational to all these other functions that your business has.
Okay.
So you have the sales reps who are doing their sales, who are talking to people. Communications is going to be how you shape perception and build trust. It's what they use.
Makes sense. But why is it not a subset of sales or marketing, for instance, right? Why is it a separate function as opposed to one of the things that a salesperson or a sales engineer or a marketing person has to do?
It is things that someone who's in sales and marketing has to do. When you're seeing in big companies who have, separate marketing teams and separate sales teams, large multinational companies, they're bringing marketing under their chief communications officer in some cases. How each company sets it up is going to be based on their needs and their history.
I see what you mean. So essentially it could either be a separate function or it could be however the structure is. The idea here is to, convey what you're doing as a business. You said both to internal and external. I'm guessing if it's internal, it's primarily only for large organizations, right? If it's for mid-sized companies or small companies, then is there something to do with internal as well? Or would it just be external communications in those cases?
Even small companies and startups have internal communications needs. When you're doing your sales training, that's internal communications. When you are sending out emails with policies, that's internal communications. All of that falls under things that you're doing, no matter what size your business is. People might not have a separate internal communications department if they are a 10-person company, but you're still doing the function.
Oh, I see what you mean. And for larger companies, let's say a company with 1,000 employees, for instance, what are some examples of internal communication that's not legal related, right? I mean, if HR is sending out an email saying, hey, watch out for this, or be careful when you say something like this, yada, 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 that's one thing. But outside of legality, when it comes to the core business, because you mentioned products and professional services, let's take an example of each of those organizations, because at Snowpal, we kind of do a little bit of both. So what would be an example of something that you internally communicate to your organization? And you could take a few examples that come to your mind.
At one organization I was at, it was as simple as technology distribution, how they figured out who had what and how that would be prioritized for different people, because that's a limited resource. And people they knew might get upset if they're not getting the latest and greatest. That had to be communicated in a way that made sense and that the policy was understood. It could be your product roadmap. When you do an all-hands meeting, you might have that at a company of any size in any industry. That's a very important part of your internal communications. How that's presented and what your leadership says is something that a chief communications officer could help with.
Wow, I see what you mean. Okay. So let's say I've gone to a lot of these all hands meetings, right? In large companies, I used to work at Oracle almost in my past life, and in a number of startups of varying sizes, right? From 80-person startups to 50 people startups to like 10 people startups, for instance, right? So the CEO comes, they have an all hands every so often, maybe once a month, maybe even more frequently. And I always thought they just winged it, right? In other words, they came and they said, so clearly that doesn't seem to be the case. So can you kind of help us understand why it's so important? Let's take a 30-person startup, for instance, right? Let's an engineering software company. Why is it important and I'm going to play the devil's advocate with the little awareness I have here, Joshua, which is people need jobs. I mean, companies need employees as well, right? Don't get me wrong. But I've always felt like it was an employer's market. I mean, not to mention with AI, with us being able to do more with fewer people, it probably is going to become more of an employer's market, maybe from what I'm learning. Given all of that, how does it even matter whether someone said the right thing or the wrong thing or said something which is not perfect? Why is it important for them to say those things correctly and more precisely?
You need your team on board. At minimum, they need to be on board and aware of what you're doing because they're the ones doing it. And I can't speak to the companies you're at. It's possible the CEOs wing their all-hands speeches. I know where I've been at when I've worked on them. They are rehearsed, they are practiced, there are slides that are prepared, and they know what they're doing well in advance.
Well, okay. So, and the idea here is not cause any confusion and make sure the spirits are high, people are motivated, and so on and so forth, right? Can you give us some specific examples of things that you've seen, not necessarily with clients that you've worked with, even outside, things that you've seen go quite wrong and things that actually have gone better, so we at least know what those differences might actually be?
When things go wrong, it's usually lack of rehearsal, lack of practice. They went in, maybe winged it. They didn't necessarily know what the topic was. They start talking, maybe they say something wrong, maybe they say something that they shouldn't have said. Remember that we all have recording devices in our pockets. Anything you say could very easily get recorded by an employee who gets disgruntled and shared somewhere you don't want it. That's a modern risk. We all are aware of those devices that we all have.
Right.
That happens. We've all seen those headlines.
Correct.
When it goes well, they've practiced, they know the story, they're prepared for the questions if they're going to take questions, and they know what's coming down the road. If someone asks, how does this relate to our product roadmap that we were just told about 2 months ago, you have an answer for that.
Great. No, that makes sense. I was just asking if you have a very specific example of something that's happened where, hey, you know what, this was miscommunicated, this actually caused confusion, and an example of something that was said so beautifully that it actually elevated things and made things change for the better.
I'm not at most companies' all hands meetings. I couldn't tell you what they're saying at them or not. I know for companies where I've been at, laying out a product roadmap or any future plans and clarifying. People come out of that with an understanding where they can move forward and do their job. And I've seen that firsthand because people know and can get back to work.
Okay, so that makes sense. So let's shift gears to a company like ours, right? A product company that's actually building products. And one of our products is a project management platform that people can sign up and manage their work at home, office, and whatnot, right? So let's say a company like us, we come to an organization like you, like Beltway Media, and say, you know what, Joshua, you can, hopefully you guys can help us play that role, right? Play the role of that fractional communications officer. So can you speak to what specifically might be some of the services that you provide? So that tells us, hey, you know what, these are things that either we are not doing, somebody's going to do it for us, which is great, or there are things that we are doing that probably we're not doing just as well. Somebody can do this better, or you know what I mean, or things that we're doing, it's taking up time and they can help us save that time essentially, right? So more specific you are, the better it's going to help our audience. So if it's a product like us or someone else's product, doesn't matter to me really. What would be the few things that you might actually do very specifically?
One of the first things we're going to do is figure out if you're communicating what you want to communicate. And that's your brand. You have a product, you have your brand, they overlap. And we look at it, people call us when they're thinking about their brand, their product, the final thing. We go back. We use the process called story, narrative, brand. Story is the stuff that happened. Narrative's the once upon a time, it answers questions, and the brand is the stuff people interact with. It's the swag, it's the pens, it's even the products, because that's the thing people are interacting with. So we'll take you through this process. And then you have to create stuff. Not stuff like your product, the communication materials. If you have a physical product, a widget, it comes in packaging. That's part of your communications materials. It's a very important one. We're going to look at it through our 4 languages model, what people read, see, hear, and experience. And what people read, people kind of get that intuitively. It's stuff you read. See, things you get with your eyes. Hear, things like podcasts, auditory content, and then experience is everything from experiential events to also how you experience what you read, see, and hear. So you'll have different ways of engaging with things. And we're going to figure out how are people engaging with your platform or your physical product. And are you communicating things to them in the way that makes sense? Because you could have a really great, clear message, But if people aren't experiencing it the way you think they're experiencing it, it might not land, which could mean your instructions aren't landing, which means your sales products aren't landing, which goes to affect the whole business.
Okay, so let's say we start with a project management platform, right? It could be ours, it could be anyone else's, right? I'm just taking a software product that's out there that you can consume. So what would be some of the initial things that you would do? Let's say you say, you know what, you need to help us. We have a product, people can sign up, they can do whatever they can possibly do through the features of that system, right? That's what we're able to share with you as a company, because we built something, we're just telling you what that thing is and what it actually does. How do you take it from there? What would be the very first thing you would do? Would you go review the product, jot down notes, or what does that initial process look like?
The first thing we're going to do is get hands-on with the product. We're going to review your communication materials. We're going to see, does this thing work the way you're advertising it? Is there a mismatch? Because that's going to be one of the first things people, buyers, they notice. If you said it could do A and it doesn't do A, they're going to notice that very quickly. So we're going to review all your communications materials and go through the product as detailed as we can. We're going to see, is this telling the same story? Are you connecting these two things? We're also going to look at other products, other materials, and your brand materials. Just general, how you communicate the company. Are you telling that same story, that same narrative across your products? Does it make sense? So if you look at a big company people might know, I'll just use like Coca-Cola. Coca-Cola products, their sodas, they're thirst quenching. Whether it's Coke, whether it's another one of their sodas, that's the same message across. We're going to see, are your products communicating something that ties in to your core brand story? And if it doesn't, we're going to start making adjustments. And we're going to start telling that in a way that makes sense. We're also going to talk to customers. We're going to get feedback from people who are actually consuming it and see, does it make sense to them? Because what makes sense to you, you're very close to it. You're not going to see it the same way. We're coming in fresh, but we're not necessarily the customer. So we'll talk to the people who are and say, does this make sense? When you read this, when you listen to this, do you understand it? Do you understand the company and the product? Sometimes the answer is yes, sometimes it's no. And then we'll go from there and start creating things for you that fit in with your brand story that help support your product.
Okay. So all of that makes complete sense, right? The one question I have though is, a lot of that sounds like, to me, it's mostly applicable to physical products, right? You mentioned Coca-Cola. I can see this be applicable, everything that you just said there, to products that you can feel and touch, right? That there's a tangible component to it. So is it not quite the same for intangibles like software products, for instance? Or how would you say that? What are some of the differences between what you just said, between a physical product like a bottle of Coke versus a software solution? Because, like, for instance, if it's Airbnb or if it's ChatGPT, I could be wrong, but I didn't think we didn't stumble into those software solutions because of anything of this nature, right? It's because people end up using it. Someone goes and tweets about it, maybe, and you install the app and you start using it. It makes sense. You tell your friend, your neighbor, your spouse and whatnot, and then it becomes rather viral, as opposed to how Coke might go about advertising, right? So does it mean the notion of communications is mostly applicable, or at least more important, to physical products than it is to products that software companies might produce?
It is absolutely applicable to software products, to things like Airbnb and ChatGPT. Those didn't just take off because someone used it and downloaded the app and told someone else. They had large campaigns behind it that worked with public relations, that worked with marketing, that really got that story into the public for them to understand. Airbnb had a story behind it. You're on a vacation, you need a place, you understand it. ChatGPT had a story behind it, that it's helping you do your writing, it's helping you with research. They might not have actual ads that you see on television, but they are doing a lot of communications.
I think that's a great point. You mentioned story, and it resonates with me because when I talked to one of the founders of a data center not too long ago, he mentioned that, one piece of advice he had given me was, he said, people might forget, when you have a conversation with somebody for a half hour or an hour, they might forget almost many things about it. But if you have one story in there, that's something that might stick around for a lot longer, right? It lingers because people remember these anecdotes and stories and whatnot. So it makes sense. You're saying they have to have a story, whether it's not paid campaigns on TV or different platforms, you're going to have a story. So let's say we chug along here, right? We have a story. We work with a company such as yours. You understand the product offering. You ask us whether it's a product, it's a service. What is it that you do? Who your customer base is, who you're targeting, who your ideal customer profile is and whatnot. And then we come up with a story, right? We come up with a story, a tagline and whatnot. What happens after that? What do you do with that story? How do you take that story that you've worked with the creators, the founders of the company? You were able to create the story based on your conversations and your understanding of their product offerings. Now that you and your internal team members have that story, how do you socialize that story? What are some distribution platforms that you use? How do you make a choice of those platforms from one product to another? How do those steps look like?
Once we have the story, and you mentioned the tagline, that's much more about the brand. That's something people interact with. Once we kind of have that story and that narrative, we're going to share, it's really going to depend on the company. Someone like Coke, they have physical ads. They have ads in magazines, on billboards, on television. Like we mentioned before, ChatGPT, at least as of right now, isn't doing that as much. If you remember, Facebook did their first ad many years after they launched. And that was a big deal for them because they were finally doing a real ad. And they're a social networking site. We're going to figure out what makes sense for you. And that is not what makes sense for everyone else. A lot of times that's working with media relations, and that's going to be less about tier one national publications, especially at first, and more about your industry publications. Is going to be looking for entrepreneur publications if you're a startup. It's going to be looking for podcasts, places where you can really share that story to very direct, pointed parts of your audience. We're going to also look for opportunities in social. It's a very important part of communications right now. It's where a lot of people are getting their information. So even if you go on a podcast, people might get that through their Instagram feed because they're not necessarily subscribers. So we're going to look for those opportunities as well. And that's going to be another channel where we distribute that story.
Okay, and then when you mentioned social, right? So let's switch gears to that because it's very important and interesting, creating content per se, right? And I've, again, through my learnings, Joshua, I've recognized that, content creation is not just for influencers or doing this for a living. Almost every company, no matter what they are doing for a business, have to have a social media presence, whether you like it or not, right? A lot of us engineers ideally don't want to spend any time there because we would rather go into our cocoons and build software because that's easier to do than worry about how the world wants to consume the software, the product that you're building, and how do you want to engage them and by way of, creating all of these different kinds of content. So let's talk a little bit about content creation and distribution, but I'm going to ask you first about distribution. You mentioned that depending on the business and the problem, you're going to pick and choose. But let me throw something out here and tell me which part of this doesn't make sense, was wrong, or needs course correction. If I said, short form content, maybe it's Instagram Reels or on TikTok, maybe YouTube Shorts. Let's say these three distribution platforms, right? Not long form content, just short form vertical content that's 3 minutes or lesser. If I use that as a strategy for every product, every service in every geographic location, is that a way to go? Or you'll be like, Krish, no, it doesn't make sense because the product should determine what the distribution should be. So not every product should be distributed on these three, distribution channels, for instance, right? How do you look at that?
The product does determine how you distribute it and where you tell that story and where you communicate. Those channels tend to be popular because there are a lot of people there, which is why they're effective. But if it doesn't make sense, because that's not where your audience is, if you are very much targeting people 70 and older, TikTok might not be the right place for you.
I'd
If
be on
you are
Fox News. I'm just kidding. Sorry, go ahead.
if you're targeting a younger demographic, TikTok or whatever comes after it might make more sense. So don't just do it to check a box. Put your effort there for a reason, because you can justify it based on the audience. Now, just because it might not have, the audience of that platform may only be 10%, women 55 to 65, that's still, if you're just using a US audience and a platform with hundreds of millions of users, tens of millions of people, it's still a lot of people in raw number that you could reach in your audience, even if it's not a large percentage of that platform. And those are the people who might be more likely to buy through social, through an online ad, through clicking, because they're already more comfortable there. So that's a trade-off you have to make, and it's very much going to be based on your budget if that's an avenue you want to pursue.
Makes sense. There's an 80-20 rule, as they say in marketing, right? I mean,
Yeah.
you can apply that towards anything. So if I were to wrap up that part of my question, if I said, Joshua, no matter what we are building, no matter who we are selling it to, if we cover these platforms, like, Reels, TikTok, and YouTube, whether it's shorts or long form content, would we not go wrong like 80% of the time? In other words, if you did no research and blindly decided to only post content that you create on these channels, would you be on the good side like 80% of the time?
You'd probably be safe most of the time. I don't know if you'd be safe 80% of the time, but if you focus on the biggest channels, it'd be like if you go back a few decades and you broadcast on primetime network television, assuming you had that budget, you're getting the most eyeballs on your thing. Numbers are, they're going to be people who are in your demographic, who are interested in your product. Just numbers give you that advantage. Same thing with the larger social media platforms now. It's where the most people are, so numbers give you that advantage.
Okay, makes sense, right? So which means that's the reason I'm asking this is companies like us, a lot of us are watching or listening to this, are going to have a similar set of questions. Everything that you share here are so definitely appreciated. So let's say we don't spend too much time on the selection of these platforms because, like you said, it may not be 80%, but it's a good, decent number. So we're going to go with these as platforms, which means that's not the most difficult decision to make. Now, let's say we go to the next step here. We decide we're going to have to go with TikTok, YouTube, and then Reels. One of the next challenges we definitely have as a company, Joshua, is given our size, we try to spend most of our energy in building software, but that's not good enough because what's the point in building it if you can't sell it, right? That's more important, not equally, but more important many times. But then we have to make a call here because we don't have the time to publish it to on all of these platforms. So we always ask ourselves, where do we want to publish this, right? We ideally would like to publish it on like 10 different platforms, but that's easier said than done. It just takes a lot of time. So how do people, if they can only publish it to one of the platforms, or there's two questions here actually. One is, if someone asked you, Joshua, should I just publish it to one platform? I know I'll not get all the bang for I won't get as much reach, but given the time I have, I'm willing to make that compromise. Is that a decent strategy? I have a second question here, but the first question is there ever a time where keeping it to a single distribution platform, either TikTok or YouTube or Instagram, does that ever turn out to be a good strategy, or is that never a good strategy?
There are companies that have built their entire business on TikTok. That is they don't have a website. They do all their sales through TikTok. They have an Etsy store. They direct people. This is where they're doing their business. This is where they're getting people. So it's possible. It's not the most common. I wouldn't recommend it for most businesses because it's a lot harder, especially if you're looking for demographics, especially B2B. They're not looking to buy through TikTok in most places. Even in B2B, there's a lot of value in using the channel, but it's a channel that you can use. And people say, well, our budget, we're looking at maybe doing one because of time. That's where you bring in someone like our firm and a fractional chief communications officer. One of the reasons we come in is a company is doing this work and they don't have a person dedicated to it. It's a founding engineer, it's a CTO because that's the person who built the website and had the logins. It's maybe a director of operations because they're kind of the catch-all person for stuff, even though they have a full-time job to do. But the company looks at it and says, we don't have a 40-hour-a-week need for communications. We'll add it to this person. And now they're doing this on top of their regular job. That they don't want to be doing this on top of their regular job.
You're
so
talking
that's
to
where
what?
we come in. Am I talking to the person who does? Yeah.
Yeah.
We come in to take that off your hands. We say frequently, we are the expert at communicating your expertise. Because we come in, and if you're spending 10 hours a week doing it that you don't want to do, because you have a product to build, we're now the expert at your expertise, and we will communicate that. And we have the tools and we have the resources to be on as many channels as you need to be on. Not everyone that's possible, because you don't need to be on everything, but all the ones where it makes sense for you. And that's where you can put your time and resources into that fractional chief communications officer role, as opposed to still doing it yourself and maybe getting less result.
Okay. Makes a lot of sense. Let's say we hire that person. You said you don't, let's say we have somebody doing it part-time internally, like say I was doing it, for instance. We now have somebody who's helping us from the outside, which again gives us back the time to do something else that we are probably better at doing, and have this person take control of some of these proceedings, right? Now, I have a few things to ask you there. One of the things is, do you create the content as well? In other words, what needs to be published on these platforms? The choice of platforms and when it gets published and how it's managed is one part of it. But the creative side of things, do you expect us as a company to give you the creative, or would you actually, as a company, work on creating that content as well?
A little bit of both. We're going to do the bulk of the creation, but you still have the assets. So if we go back to the physical product and packaging, which I mentioned is an important part of your communications, we're going to use that packaging that you already have, that was already created, and put that in your communications that we're then creating. So yes, we are creating the bulk of it, but you have a lot of those original assets that we need to use. Also, we do a lot of what we call content repurposing through content flights. So right now we're recording a podcast. That podcast can very easily become multiple Instagram videos or YouTube shorts or TikTok videos, which can then also be going to LinkedIn, all of which get text. That text can then be reused and spread out again onto those channels. So one thing can become multiple new sources of content. We're not probably going to be the front man for your company going on a podcast or being in a press release. You're going to be the person creating that. You'll be the person on the podcast. You'll be the person talking to the press. But then we'll create the stuff from that.
Okay, makes sense. And let's say once you work with us, we have a piece of content, maybe it's video, maybe it's a blog, maybe it's an article, and it gets published, for instance. And then after that, do you check on that? In other words, managing the efficacy of the content that was created and distributed on these different platforms. Hey, you know what? We created 4 videos, 3 verticals, 1 long form content. We published them on YouTube and Reels and YouTube Shorts and whatnot. We let it sit there for a week or 2. This is the viewership that we've seen. This is the traction there is between the different pieces of content that we created. Some did well, some not so much. And here is why we think one did well versus another. So the analytics of this, right? The digital analytics of it, is that something that you would be doing and taking it to your clients and telling them, hey, this worked, this did not work. So let's start focusing more on the things that actually did work. So is that coming from you?
That's coming from us. It probably wouldn't be in the 1 week window because a lot of online content, it gets a good number of views often. This is a broad rule in those first, hour, 24 hours, 3 days. But it's still there after 3 days. We had a LinkedIn post that didn't do so great in the first 3 days. By the first week, it was doing great because it started getting some more comments after day 5. Then it shot up. So remember, these things are still out there for a long time. I was looking at some data on podcasts. It was, a podcast was getting 1,000 or so downloads per week. Well, per new weekly episode. But by the end of the year, because they were going back, we were looking at historical data, it wasn't linear. Individual episodes would spike and really take off because it's still out there.
Right. So when it comes to social media and algorithms, we are all at the mercy of these ever-changing algorithms, right? A YouTuber who did very well suddenly does not get any views, and I've had a lot of them share. I actually follow a Norwegian YouTuber. He's a really, really smart YouTuber who used to get a lot more views than he has gotten lately, and he said, okay, maybe YouTube changed their algorithms one more time, and now he's going to do A/B testing and whatnot to figure out what kind of content resonates, because his audience likes the content, right? But yet more new people have to start watching it for him to be able to grow as a YouTuber. I mean, there's no real answer here, right, Joshua? It's always trial and error, right? Is it always a matter of trial and error, or given what you're doing and the experience you have as a company, would you sometimes be able to tell upfront saying, hey, Krish, I expect for this to work, but not for that to work? Or is it almost always, it's difficult to tell, we just have to put it out there and see how it goes?
A little bit of both. We know on, say, LinkedIn, certain things will work really well. We know LinkedIn likes to promote certain types of content. Carousels and videos do very well on LinkedIn. If you're on LinkedIn, if your audience on LinkedIn, I'm sure they've seen both coming up in feeds a lot more. We know that is true. Will yours do well? Well, then we have to start tweaking your specific content and the substance of it and how it engages. But we can start with those two broad categories. We are at the mercy of these algorithms. People say master the algorithm. That's great until it changes. And then you have to try and start that again. That's where you kind of have to work on just those core things that you know have the best chance of success. And then you could optimize around the edges for the algorithms, because it's always going to be certain things that are shareable. They're not changing the core part of it, usually. Okay. It's the edges of it. And that can make a big difference if you're a YouTuber. It could really change who sees it. But some of the core things in that algorithm probably stay the same.
Okay. So if we talked about B2B communications, if you have to list the top 3 platforms in your experience that seems to work well, what would those be? Is LinkedIn one of them? If not, if you have to name 3 of them in the order of importance, what would those be?
LinkedIn's probably 1. Facebook is surprisingly 2. There's a lot of commerce happening on Facebook with small businesses. They're purchasing software, they're purchasing things for their business on Facebook. That is not always been true, but it's really becoming more common recently, within the last year or so. And then I would say email lists are very popular. They work given certain conditions. You're sending stuff that's useful, that people find valuable, and you have a good opt-in targeted list. If you're just spamming, it won't be effective. But if you have a good opt-in targeted list, it can be extremely effective.
Well, okay, you make some good points there. Let's dig into each of them, right? So you said 3, LinkedIn, the third was email, second was Facebook. Is that in that order of importance from what you've seen? Like number one is LinkedIn, number two is Facebook.
Probably generally for most companies.
Okay. If it's LinkedIn, let's talk about each of them. Let me start with the third one, their emails. You mentioned a good opted-in list where you're not spamming people. How do you first get to that list? Because when you're a new company or not old enough or not been there for too long, where do you get that list from? Because people have to sign up or subscribe for you to actually communicate with them. So the part of the initial challenge is, where do you get that list? I know there are people who sell it and I don't know if it's ethical or not or whatnot, but how do you get to that initial list, Joshua?
Well, this is where the platforms play into each other and where we talk a lot about amplification. What you do on one platform, what you do with another platform, how you read, how you see, how you hear, you experience, all needs to amplify each other. So you can put on LinkedIn that to sign up for your email list and get people that way. When you are getting product signups for demos, for wait lists, that can go, have a checkbox. Would you like to receive emails from us? We've all seen those checkboxes all the time. We usually see them pre-checked, and you have to deselect it and opt out because that's how companies get your email address to go on their list. But use your other platforms to get people for that good list. Because a list of 100 people that's really targeted, that want to get your information, is going to be a lot more valuable to you than a list of 1,000 people who report your domain and your addresses as spam, who don't want to get your information.
Well, that's an incredibly important point you make there. Thank you so much for sharing that. So the next two items you mentioned are Facebook, right? Let's go with Facebook the last because that's the least I know about, at least in what I want to ask you. Let's go with LinkedIn, right? A lot of us are on LinkedIn, like we enjoy it. There are times I take a break from it because I spend too much time and then I spend too little time, like I haven't caught up in like a month or two there. What is like the frequency? I mean, people have told me, Joshua, that, hey, you know what, Chris, you guys should post on a Monday morning, Eastern time, or not a Friday evening Pacific time, for instance, right? So like, does the timing of your post matter? The second question is the content, the type of content, right? Whether it's a video, you mentioned videos earlier, whether it's a blurb where you write something about it, it's a post. What are some things you can give us as advice that you're like, these are some things that you've seen actually work on LinkedIn?
The type of content matters. Videos and carousels are more effective. They push them out. LinkedIn puts them into people's feeds. Time matters. Whether or not 9 a.m. Eastern is better than 9 a.m. Pacific. I've seen a lot of data that basically says post during business hours, and it'll probably be good. If you know you're targeting people in mountain time, optimize for that. But if you're just broadly saying U.S. people on LinkedIn, you could get them all if you mostly post during U.S. business hours. I have seen, and this is from our own posts that we've done for ourselves and for other people, after hours can be very effective. It depends, but we've seen it be very effective if you have the right content. What's right is going to depend on your business and you and what you want to do. But if you have something that works for you, going after hours can work. And you have to remember, you're probably not going to make the sale on LinkedIn. That's not what you're using it for. It's to inform people. It's to tell people what your product is, what your company is, what you guys are doing. Because it takes 7, 14, 21 touch points for someone to make a decision. Which means you need to hit them with your content 7, 14, 21, or even more times across platforms for them to make that decision to buy, which is a lot. Yeah. So that's why I recommend being on these platforms more and getting stuff out there, even if it doesn't seem the most natural for your product, because people are still seeing it, people are still interacting with it, and it's still an effective touch point. Even if it's not the one that says, I'm buying right now.
Correct, because your idea is to have them interested enough so you're able to chat with them, get them on a message, on a call, and then take that conversation forward, right? Now you mentioned the time, you know, does matter but doesn't matter. So let me, you mentioned after hours as well, right? But
Yes.
let's say if you're selling software and it's generic piece of software, like what we do, what's peak hours or work hours for one time zone is different from another. I mean, when we are done with the day, Asia comes into play, or
Yeah.
Europe or some point, right? So which means, is it all right to ignore when you're posting, which is what we are doing, but I don't know if it's the right thing. Like, can we say that we don't care when we post, like the timing shouldn't play a role at all? Or do you think we should be cognizant of that?
Be aware of the time, but don't be beholden to it. If you want to publish something on Tuesday and you said we'll publish it 9 a.m. Tuesday and you guys forgot and it's now 10, publish it at 10.
Right, okay. And then the frequency of posting this content, does that matter? Like sometimes you hear people say post once a day, post once every 2 days. What have you seen work better than the other?
Depends on the company, depends on the platform. LinkedIn gives their stats for effectiveness based on people who post 2 to 3 times per week. See certain results. That's how they are pushing people to post on LinkedIn, is if you post 2 to 3 times per week, people see this. Some people post more, some people post less. Do what feels right, do what's natural, do what fits with your content. If you don't have enough content to fill 3 a week, do 2 a week, because you don't want to just become spam that people ignore. If you have 3 good pieces or 4 good pieces that week, do it if it's valuable. But don't do it just to do it.
Makes sense. And then the length of the content, like let's say on LinkedIn, I think it lets you post videos up to like 15 minutes. We sometimes post like 8 minute or 10 minute, 12 minutes, other times like 1 minute or 2 minutes. You know, people's attention spans have unfortunately diminished with tools like TikTok and Reels, where it's a 3 minute video, but even sometimes 3 minutes feels long and people are switching to the next one even before that. So in a world that we live in, Joshua, where things are, you know, we don't have enough time to do everything that we want to do, right? It's a hustle business essentially. What should the length of that video that we post on LinkedIn be, roughly speaking?
My first internship, I got this piece of advice. I was doing some broadcast television at the time, and I asked our producer, how long should my piece be? And this very experienced producer, she said to me, make it as long as it needs to be. And here I am, my first internship, getting this. I'm like, well, we have a broadcast schedule. We have very strict time we have to stick to. We have to fit it within this window. We have commercials. Like, make it as long as it needs to be, and we'll make it work. And that has been one of the best pieces of advice I've ever gotten. Make your content as long as it needs to be. If it's good at 2 minutes, leave it at 2 minutes. If it's comfortable at 7, leave it at 7. People do engage with long form content if it is good, if it is valuable to them. They're not just going to watch it if it's bad because they can just click the box and go to the next thing. If it's providing value, if they're enjoying it, they will read it, they will watch it.
I think it's very good to know. So in other words, let the content dictate the length, not the platform or the algorithms dictate the length, because you have no control over either the platform or the algorithms, but you do have control over the quality of the content that you do post. So your advice there is just take as much or as little time as you think that content warrants, essentially, right? Okay, thanks for sharing that.
Yes.
That's good to know. Now that we posted there, right? A basic question there. Let's say you have, say, 10,000 connections on LinkedIn, right? Let's say some of us have carefully curated list of connections. Other people maybe accept a lot more connections, but let's go with the people, like, for instance, we don't accept all our requests, right? We are very careful about who we are connecting with. So we have a good set of connections, right, that we've accumulated over the years. Now, when we post content, surely they are aware of it because it's going to pop up in their feed. How does the platform then push that outside of your core network? Is it based on the likes and the engagement that your conversation or your post actually gets from within your network? Or are there other factors that determine how many more people are going to see this that don't happen to be in your network?
Both of those things. Initially, it's going to be based off of engagement. That's how all these platforms work. You see your friend like this, your connection commented on that post, and that's how you see it. Now, in terms of things that keep showing to people who aren't in your network, that is where paid ads come in. You want to boost your post, you have to pay. That is how these platforms make money. They are businesses. They sell ads. That is their source of revenue. If you want to get that extra boost, pay for it.
Which means if you don't pay for it, Joshua, does it mean it's very... I mean, in other words, if you did want for your content to consistently go outside your network, is the only real option to actually buy these ads on these platforms?
It's the most reliable option, especially if you have a carefully curated network on LinkedIn or on your other platforms. Paying is going to be the most reliable way to get more eyeballs on your content and to get more engagement.
Okay. And then when you go to LinkedIn or YouTube, for instance, right? You see these clickbait titles all the time because they want you to click on that or watch it or, entice you, luring you into watching or reading something that might actually be unrelated to what the title or the thumbnail actually said. Mm-hmm. Now, we've never done that because it makes us uncomfortable. But I've had people give us this advice all the time saying, you know what, this is a good video or this is a good piece of content, but your title is very mellowed down, right? It's not dramatized. It has to be a lot more dramatic for people to actually want to react to it. How should we go about this as regular people who are creating content, right? We're not in the business of marketing. We are in the business of creating software, but software needs to be marketed. So there's always this mental challenge, and you don't agree with yourself when you have a title that's fancier than you think your content really is, right? I mean, I feel like we need a sense of humility because, you always feel like other people can do what you're doing. There's somebody who can do what you're doing a lot better than you can ever imagine. So that brings that humility and not being braggadocious about what you're posting. But I've seen quite the opposite where people are a lot more confident than sometimes we can be, even if they knew a little bit lesser about that subject matter. So what do you recommend? Should there be a catchy title, a beautiful thumbnail, or again, how should someone go about this?
Well, you touched on one thing. You said you're not marketers, you're not in communications. That is where you bring in someone like us who can help you with that. That's why we're the expert at communicating your expertise. Your expertise is your product in the video. We're the experts at getting people to engage with it through communications. I wouldn't ever tell someone to do a title or any content they're not comfortable with because it won't work. It'll ultimately backfire probably. So don't go too far with it. But you can make something that's more engaging and not be completely unrelated clickbait. And to do that, that's exactly where you bring in someone who has the communications expertise to help you figure out where that line is.
Okay. So does it mean, Joshua, that we're living in a world where, I don't know if it's a new world or the world has been the same, just the platforms have changed? You didn't have TikTok like 10 years ago. You had something else that perhaps did something along these lines. But my question really is, sometimes, when you're a developer or you're a founder of a company, you're very excited about building whatever it is that you're building, right? Let's say you're building a piece of software. You want to go focus all your attention on that. You almost want the universe to come to you and find it because you're doing your part, which you feel like is the quality of the offering that you build. Does that mean that's not the right way to go because you have to do what needs to be done, meaning it doesn't make sense to spend all energies in building a phenomenal product offering and spending very little time in having that be communicated to the larger world out there because you're going to die just keeping the product in your shelf. So you've got to draw this balance. If so, what is the right balance if there is even a number? I mean, I know it again depends on the product and the customer and the platform. But if you had to generalize the time you have to spend in building something versus socializing what you've built, how would that look like?
And if you're talking at a startup where you're doing it yourself, probably depends on the stage of your product as much as anything else. If you are really pre-release, it'll be a lot less, but you want to socialize people to the idea of it. Get that out there, become known. Once you are getting ready to sell, and people bring us in oftentimes really close to when they're going live, when you want to bring in your communications as early as possible for this reason, is you want to start shifting to doing more of it and putting resources there as early as possible. Someone said to me once that they spend 50% of their time on communications, marketing, and growth, and 50% on doing what their thing is. That's probably for most businesses, about right these days, because you have to produce so much content and you have to put so much out there.
I mean,
You're not personally doing it. That's why you have people like us who are taking that 50% off of your desk so you can do all of your job.
That's very good to know. I think I wanted some number, and that number is actually kind of what I was hoping you would say, Krish, do 80% of your time, spend it on building it, and 20%. I knew that was not going to be the case, but at least I think it's somewhere in smack in the middle, right? That's actually very good to know. I mean, we have a few more minutes. I have a couple of more things to ask you, but again, thank you for sharing all of this with us, everything you've said so far. Before I go to the last set of my questions, Joshua, I'll ask you one more thing and then give you an opportunity to ask me anything if you did want to ask me something, and then I'll wrap up with the last questions and have you have the closing comments. My last question before we switch gears to you asking me something is the elephant in the room, if you will. I mean, there's no conversation can be called complete today, not a dinner with a family, not breakfast by yourself, if there was no conversation or a monologue about AI, right? Either it's with somebody or it's with yourself, but it's hard to be oblivious and agnostic to what's happening. So I'm going to ask you one of the questions that people have asked me. I'm just going to bounce it back at you, which is, okay, now there are all of these tools available. Developers, you need one where you needed 10 of them, for instance. That's fairly true with a lot of the white collar jobs, right, to a large extent. So the question, again, I'm just redirecting the questions that have come to me to you, just rephrasing it a bit, is why do we need to hire somebody to help us with all? These are real problems and we need real help. There's no question about that. But if there are AI tools and Claude models that can guide us do all of these, why do we need to go look for somebody to help us? And this is a very, it's a genuinely phrased devil's advocate question. Yeah. You know what I mean? So what would an answer to that be?
We get this question all the time, and it's a really simple answer is you still have to do the AI work. You still have to give it the prompts. You still have to take the output. You still have to clean it up. So maybe before you would have had 20 hours a week on your desk that you're now handing off to a fractional person. Now it's 10, but that's still 10 hours on your desk that's taking you away from your core job that you could put off onto somebody else who specializes in it.
Okay, so there's two parts to it then, right? One is the tools that we would be using ourselves. Now you'd work with somebody who uses those tools, which means if we were originally spending, say, 20% of our time, we would have to spend 10% of our time, but you're saying you still have to spend the 10%, which you could be spending on something that you have to be doing and not something you something you can do and will have to do, as opposed to something that you can delegate to somebody else, right? That's a good point. The second point you mentioned there, just to rephrase that and say it just in my own words, is there's also an element of expertise you bring to the table, right? The fact that you're doing this for a living and as a business, this is your expertise, right? Communications, marketing, and strategies and whatnot. So no matter how much we think we can do, you can do it better, right? Whether it's slightly better, marginally better, or dramatically better, or that's just depends on the company and the problem. But it's fair to say that, right, Joshua? And the reason I mentioned that is this is the same question we get asked and everybody else get asked as well. Like, there were articles going around with, is SaaS dead? SaaS is not dead, but it's going to take shape differently, right? Take a slightly different shape given everything that's been happening. So Salesforce is maybe not going away as a company, but they probably have to do things a little bit differently. So what do you have to tell people if you have to sort of summarize this part and say, you know what, even with AI and all the tools and Claude and Codex and OpenClaw and whatnot, that the need for specialized help is not going away, but it's just changing, right? And I truly believe this and feel it. And I can see that you agree with that as well. But if you have to sort of summarize this nicely in your own words, maybe with an example, how would you structure this response?
AI is a tool. If you gave me a hammer, who knows what the result would be? You give a master craftsman a hammer, you could get a beautiful structure out of that you could live in. That's the difference. You could do a lot with AI, but it wouldn't be the same as if you hired a communications expert who has the human expertise to supplement the tool and use the tool to its maximum capacity.
Which means the advent of these AI tools, do you ever lose sleep because you're like, you know what, this is starting to do a lot of what we are doing or we could be doing or we have been doing? Or is it not something that's actually given you any cause for concern thus far?
Not losing sleep over it, lose sleep for other reasons, but not over this. What we do is we use AI, but like I said, it's a tool. It helps us. One thing, we do a lot of research for our clients. It's great as a research tool. We had to get market analysis on 2025 metro areas. AI could do that. It was basically running repetitive Google searches to get vital information from, city, national, state databases. Nothing that you couldn't get off a Google search. But it would take a human a lot of time to do that Google search, get the information, put it into a chart, make it readable and usable. That's what AI is really great at, getting that information and putting it in a way that we could use it. That saved time, and then we could focus on what humans do best.
Okay, lovely. It brings me to my last technical question. I have then one non-technical question, but I'll have you ask me anything as well. So the last technical question is regarding what we had been conversing about. We've talked a lot about content, right? Distribution, platforms, and approaches, what works, what doesn't work, and so on. As a software company, when we create content, the content is around the periphery of what we do, right? Either it's smack in the middle, it's about writing code, building software, or like I mentioned to you before we hit record, we expanded our conversations to running a company and talking about other facets that are just as important, if not more, about a company. But that's where all our conversations are around. Now that's useful information, hopefully, right? And it's interesting and it takes a lot of time and effort and energy to create, but that is not necessarily entertaining, right? And now when we look at our viewership on content that we post, I give this example, right? I'm going to share that example with you. And for people who watch the podcast, sorry, there's going to be a redundant share, but I'm going to share it with Joshua so I can get his opinion on this. So I saw a video not too long ago, Joshua. Somebody went to Costco. An Indian guy went there. He took his camera. He just went aisle by aisle, looked up all the Indian products. I mean, I don't shop there, but apparently they sell a lot of Indian products per se, at least in certain pockets of the country. He takes that out of the shelf, shows the product name and the price, puts them back on the shelf. He chugs along, goes to the next product, Indian product, and next shelf, and so on and so forth, right? I mean, I wouldn't watch something like this for sure, but I did watch 25 minutes of that video, a long form content, because it had raked up like 6 or 8 million views or some insane number in a matter of 1 or 2 days. Now I'm thinking, I mean, I could go to Costco.com and I could have done that in like 3 minutes. I could have told what products they're selling that might be relevant to Indian cooking or something of that nature. But the reality of the matter was that did rake 8 million views. Lots of comments, a lot of engagement. And here it takes a lot more time and money and effort and energy, at least in my opinion, to having these incredible conversations with people such as yourself. And it's not 3 million views that we are seeing necessarily, right? So part of me, the question really, that's the background and the context, and the question I'm going to ask you here is, entertainment sells more. From what I'm reading, from what I'm watching, from what the feed seems to be, right? For every 9 entertainment related videos, whether it's singing or music or politics or whatnot, there's one that is very specific to engineering and software and hardware and GPUs and chips and whatnot. So even companies that are not in the business of entertainment, the type of content we are creating should that be relevant to what we do as a business because we socialize that? Or should we use that as an opportunity to just tell people we exist? Meaning Krish is dancing here and that gets 2 million views because he's a terrible dancer. And then people figure out that Krish runs Snowpal and Snowpal does X, Y, and Z as a company. What are your thoughts on this and which way do you recommend one should go?
Both can work. You want to usually stay within kind of the heartland of your business, which could mean doing, tutorials on coding, development, software, short ones, long ones that people can use. A lot of companies, especially in the developing space, have started doing that because it just gets people to know about their company, their product, and that they're useful. And these are tutorials on basic software development, back-end coding. They're not giving away their internal code or trade secrets. That's a great way. And it's helpful, it's useful. We always think all content should be useful. Being entertaining is useful. There are companies that will make meme videos and share them because they know they get clicks. I wouldn't chase every single one, but if you have one that works and you have a good idea and you can make it work, do the dance and get 2 million views.
So in other words, the majority of what you're suggesting we do is stick to our area of expertise and figure out what works in that space. But at the same time, not just preclude ourselves from doing stuff that's unrelated, that falls entirely in the space of entertainment. Would that be a right way to summarize that, Joshua?
Usually, yeah. Because entertaining is useful. We all like to be entertained. But you still want to focus on what you're doing and not become only a YouTube channel of your dance videos. Unless you want to start a YouTube channel of your dance videos.
Okay. But ultimately, content creation is important, is what we are summarizing through our conversation here. In other words,
it's critical.
Very critical to success. Makes sense. Okay, I have a very last non-technical question. But before I do that, do you have any questions for me? I've been throwing questions at you. You've been patiently answering them. So you can ask me anything that you want to ask me.
You've said that, a lot of this stuff is falling on your desk, that you're doing it. If you could offload it, if you could solve one of your communications problems in any way, what would you do and how would you do it?
How would I do it is hopefully we have the budget to work with someone like Joshua and the company, right? That's the ideal scenario. As a company, we are spending money on various different areas, and working with somebody like you and your organization that specializes in this is a no-brainer to me, right? That need is there. I mean, I wouldn't even deny it. Doesn't matter what tools are available, like you mentioned, working with people who've done this, who know more about this, and being humble about things you're not good at, I think is very important and imperative to success, in my opinion, right? Now, one part of, if I played the devil's advocate on both sides of the spectrum, I could say, is it impossible for me to figure out a lot of these things? Maybe not. You know what I mean? If I put my mind to it, maybe I can figure some of these out. But the other side of the spectrum, I don't know a lot of this. And even if I did spend a lot of time, it's going to take plenty of time to come anywhere close to somebody like you who's been doing this for a while and who does it well. So that is that problem. There is a learning curve. There is the time being spent. And two, you're not doing what you should otherwise be doing. Because here, Joshua and his company can help us with the communications, but maybe not so much with the development of the software, right? Assuming you don't do that, but let's say if you did that, that's different. But I'm just saying,
we are not software developers.
Right. So in other words, there could be another company that does that. So every company needs to have its core competence. Now, if you end up outsourcing or giving everything you do to everybody else, then I don't know what you have as intellectual property, right? So there's got to be a balance there, in my opinion. If you're a software company, there are some things you hopefully are good at and you want to do it yourself. And there are other things that need to be done which you're either not good at or you don't even know what needs done. Like I was talking to somebody the other day and he mentioned that, I think the Rumsfeld theory or one of those things, it's called the known knowns, known unknowns, unknown knowns, and unknown unknowns, which is no better way to put that, right? The unknown unknowns, we can't tell, but there are a lot of known unknowns, and we need help as companies, right, to do the best of what we can with those known unknowns. So I think it's important, right? That's the second part of answering the second part of the question. The first part is we have many challenges. One of them, Joshua, is let's say we launched our first B2C product 5 years ago, 4.5 years ago, and we've added to the list of products our product suite since, right? We're a small company, we have a good breadth of products. Each of those products needs its own communication, right? There is a different audience for each of those offerings. They're very different from each other. There is more of some and less of some others, but regardless, each of them is uniquely different. Uniquely different is redundant. Each of them is unique from the other. So we need to create a corporate communication strategy that makes the most sense for each of those products. Now, you need to be able to tell the difference between the products and tell what the communication should actually be. So each of those products, end up in the hands of the right people that find the most value out of those product offerings. That's a full-time job. You know what I mean? You mentioned a fractional chief communications officer, right? I was going to say it can start out as fractional, but sometimes you need a lot of time. So it's not a question of 2 hours or 10 hours or 40, right? It just depends on how good, bad, or ugly you are. I mean, not physically, I'm just saying as from an intellectual standpoint that you can sometimes get the same thing done a whole lot faster than somebody, right? If it takes Krish like 15 hours to come to a decision and do something, Joshua might be able to do it in like 2 hours, right? Which means, for one, I got that in incredibly faster time, like 1/7 of the time. And two, I did not even have to do it in the first place, right? You just have to worry about budgeting, for instance. So to me, we've got many challenges in this space. Advertising, right? Platforms. We spend money on, say, a little bit on Pinterest or LinkedIn and Facebook and Meta and Google and whatnot. All of them are expensive. We have to figure out what our ad budget is going to be, how much of it can be towards marketing, how much should go towards sales and advertising. So part of the problem, as I've learned, live and learn, before I launched the company, I thought the most difficult problems would be engineering problems. And I was worried that I wouldn't be able to solve those engineering problems. The funny irony is, of course, we still have a lot of engineering problems, right? It's a software company and things always change. But we are able to solve a lot of those problems just because we do that for a living. But the things that we'd never thought about, Joshua, are the most difficult problems, right? Sales, advertising, marketing, communications, and the whole gamut of everything that is not code, executable code, is something that does not come naturally to us. So, even to turn the camera on to do a recording, nobody else in the team wants to do that. So I've got to be this person who does that, for instance, right? So I know, hopefully that answered some of what you asked there, right?
It did.
Anything else you want to ask me?
What's your last question?
Well, my last question is, you're going out to dinner, you can pick your cuisine. It doesn't have to be, I need your favorite appetizer, favorite dessert, one dish, and favorite entree, favorite appetizer, favorite dessert. They all don't have to be part of the same cuisine, but they could be, right? But what would be your best choice of these three things?
If I'm going out to dinner, I'm picking a steakhouse. Appetizer. Ooh. Let's start with the main course. Be a ribeye steak.
Okay.
Dessert. Probably chocolate cake of some kind, depending on what the place has. And an appetizer. So there was a great bar in New York that had a mac and cheese appetizer that was really good. The place has since closed, but I would probably pick that.
Okay. That sounds, it's the last two of my guests actually have said steak, but they said different types of steak. I think one of them said brisket, which I think is a steak as well, right? But probably a different...
It's a beef, yeah.
Okay, yep. So, okay, that's good. Thank you for sharing that. Thank you so much, Joshua. I'm going to just give a quick reintroduction so people know. Again, thanks for taking the time and sharing all of the wonderful things that you did share with me and us here. Joshua runs the communications team. He's the managing director at Beltway Media. We'll include the link to your LinkedIn profile and to Beltway Media so folks can certainly reach out to you. That's it. If you could just have your closing comments, And then after you're done, just please stay on the podcast for a couple of minutes after we call it done, but just closing comments from you.
When you're creating content, when you're doing your communications, the key thing is be the signal, not the noise. That means communicate strategically, not voluminously.
Anything more? Or is that it for closing comments?
You could reach us by email. I'm jaltman@beltway.media. You could also find me on LinkedIn. You'll have the link below. It's linkedin.com/in/Joshua I. Altman. Thank you for having me on the show.
Thank you so much, Joshua. And folks, until next time, bye-bye.